In a prestigious school where success is valued above justice, one student is pushed to the brink of humiliation and anger when a teacher, driven by prejudice, commits an act that will change her life forever. But what happens when this girl, surrounded by the silence of the majority, decides to fight for herself and others? The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting golden lines across Naomi's bedroom walls. She stared at the ceiling, her alarm clock still a few minutes away from going off, but the knot in her stomach was already tight. The prospect of another day at Pinewood Academy, a prestigious but isolating school, weighed heavily on her. Being one of the few black students in a predominantly white environment felt like walking a tightrope every day. One misstep, one wrong word, and she'd fall into the pit of stereotypes and judgments. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. The quiet hum of the house was comforting, but it couldn't erase her unease. On her desk, her chemistry textbook and notes were meticulously arranged, an extension of her need to be perfect in a place where mediocrity wasn't an option for someone like her. Naomi took pride in her academic achievements, but she knew that, for some, her success was a point of contention rather than celebration. "Naomi, breakfast!" Her father's voice echoed up the stairs, warm but firm. "I'm coming," she called back, her voice steady, though her mind was anything but. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of coffee and toast. Her father, Daniel Carter, was already seated at the table, scrolling through news on his tablet. His presence was a grounding force in her life, a man who balanced his career as a civil rights attorney with being an unwavering pillar of support for her. Despite his demanding job, he always made time for her, even on the busiest mornings. "Morning, sweetheart," he greeted, looking up with a smile. "Ready for another day of conquering the academic world?" "No," Naomi forced a small laugh as she sat down. "No," something like that. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said quickly, focusing on buttering her toast. "Just school." He didn't press further, but she could feel his concern lingering in the air. He knew better than to push her, especially when she wasn't ready to share. Still, his subtle way of offering support, like pouring her a glass of orange juice without her asking, reminded her that she wasn't alone. The ride to school was quiet. Daniel's car cut through the pristine streets of the suburban neighborhood surrounding Pinewood Academy. The houses here were large, their manicured lawns a reflection of the wealth that defined the community. Naomi often felt like an outsider in this world, despite the scholarship that had earned her a place at the school. She gazed out the window, her thoughts racing as they neared the gates. "Remember," Daniel said as he pulled up, "you're stronger than anything or anyone that tries to tear you down." Naomi nodded, gripping the straps of her backpack. She stepped out, plastering on a neutral expression as she approached the school's entrance. The grand stone building loomed above her, a symbol of both opportunity and suffocation. The day began like any other. In the cafeteria, Naomi sat alone at a corner table, her tray untouched. She pretended not to notice the glances from her classmates or the quiet whispers that followed her. Over time, she had learned to block out most of it, but the loneliness still gnawed at her. Chemistry class was the highlight of her day. Or at least, it used to be. Science fascinated her, offering a sense of control and clarity that the social dynamics of Pinewood could never provide. But lately the class had become a source of stress, thanks to Mr. Grayson. He was the kind of teacher who thrived on making students uncomfortable, his sharp wit often crossing the line into outright cruelty. With Naomi, his remarks carried an extra edge. Whether it was calling her out for minor mistakes or turning her into the subject of his jokes, he always found a way to undermine her. Today was no different. "Miss Carter," Mr. Grayson said as he entered the classroom, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "our resident genius. How fortunate we are to have your brilliance guiding us." Naomi stiffened, but kept her gaze on her notebook. She had learned that responding only gave him more ammunition. "We'll be conducting a rather expansive experiment tomorrow," he continued, his eyes narrowing on her. "And since you're so talented, I think you're the perfect candidate to assist me. Consider it a challenge." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Naomi. Some of her classmates smirked, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. Naomi felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but forced herself to nod. "Of course, Mr. Grayson," she said evenly, her voice betraying none of the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur. Mr. Grayson's voice droned on about chemical reactions, but Naomi couldn't focus. She was too busy replaying the moment in her head, dreading what tomorrow might bring. When the bell rang, she gathered her things quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As she walked down the hall, she caught snippets of conversation, her name paired with laughter and whispered jokes. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she kept her head down. By the time she got home that evening, she was exhausted. She collapsed onto her bed, staring at the ceiling once more. The knot in her stomach had only tightened, and no matter how much she tried to push the day's events out of her mind, they lingered like a shadow. Tomorrow was going to be worse. She could feel it. The next morning came too quickly. Naomi barely slept, her mind replaying Mr. Grayson's pointed remarks and the weight of the challenge he had assigned her. As she got ready, she tied her thick curls into a secure bun, more out of habit than forethought, and shoved her chemistry notes into her backpack. The house was quiet, her father already at his office for an early case. She was grateful for the solitude, though it did little to calm her nerves. By the time she arrived at Pinewood Academy, the halls were already bustling. Naomi slipped into the chemistry lab early, hoping to prepare for the experiment without the judgmental eyes of her classmates. The familiar scent of ethanol and cleaning solution filled the air, and for a brief moment she felt a sense of calm. The lab was her domain, a place where equations made sense and reactions followed predictable patterns. But the calm was short-lived. Mr. Grayson entered the room abruptly, his presence as oppressive as ever. He set his briefcase on the desk and glanced at Naomi, his expression a mix of condescension and amusement. "Miss Carter, punctual as expected," he said, his voice laced with false praise. "Let's see if your preparation matches your enthusiasm." Naomi swallowed hard and nodded, avoiding his gaze. She reviewed the experiment setup once more, double-checking the Bunsen burners, reagents, and glassware. The experiment involved demonstrating an exothermic reaction using a volatile substance. The instructions were complex, but Naomi had gone over them repeatedly the night before. She wasn't going to give Mr. Grayson any excuse to humiliate her, at least not willingly. As the bell rang and students filed into the lab, Naomi's chest tightened. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers that followed her every move. Mr. Grayson called the class to attention, his booming voice silencing the chatter. "Today, we're conducting a demonstration of controlled combustion," he announced. "Pay close attention. Chemistry is as much about precision as it is about understanding the inherent risks." He turned to Naomi, a sharp smile playing on his lips. "Miss Carter, would you care to join me at the front?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward, her heart pounding. She focused on the experiment table, trying to drown out the murmurs from the back of the room. "Now," Mr. Grayson continued, addressing the class, "Miss Carter will assist me in setting up the reaction. Watch closely. This is not an experiment for the faint of heart." The setup began smoothly. Naomi measured out the chemicals with steady hands, carefully following the instructions Mr. Grayson provided. He loomed over her, pointing out minute details with exaggerated criticism. "Steady hands, Miss Carter. We wouldn't want an accident now, would we?" he said, loud enough for the whole class to hear. She ignored him, focusing on her task, but as the reaction neared its critical stage, Mr. Grayson abruptly changed the instructions. "Add a bit more of the oxidizer," he said casually. Naomi froze, her eyes dotting to the notes. That wasn't part of the procedure. She hesitated, her instinct screaming that this was wrong. "Is there a problem?" Mr. Grayson asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Surely someone of your caliber can handle a minor adjustment?" The class chuckled nervously, the tension in the room palpable. Naomi's cheeks burned, but she complied, adding a few extra drops of the substance as instructed. Almost immediately, she noticed something was off. The mixture in the beaker began bubbling violently, the reaction more volatile than expected. "Stand back," Mr. Grayson said, his voice suddenly serious. Naomi took a step back, but not before a small splash of the liquid landed on her hand. She flinched, the chemicals stinging her skin, but she had no time to react further. In the chaos, her hair, her tightly wound bun, was suddenly and horrifyingly caught in the path of a spark. The flame was instantaneous. One moment she was standing there, and the next heat surged through her scalp. Gasps and shouts erupted from the class as Naomi screamed, instinctively batting at her head. Mr. Grayson fumbled for the fire extinguisher, his movements sluggish and disorganized. By the time he managed to put out the fire, Naomi was shaking, her face pale and streaked with tears. The acrid smell of burnt hair filled the air, mingling with the stunned silence of the classroom. Her classmates stared, some wide-eyed, others whispering to each other in shock. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat, his usual arrogance replaced by a strained veneer of concern. "A minor mishap," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let this be a lesson in the importance of caution." Naomi couldn't believe what she was hearing. A minor mishap? Her scalp still burned, her hair was charred, and the humiliation of being at the center of this spectacle was overwhelming. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, ignoring the murmurs that followed her. The hallway blurred as she ran, her vision clouded by tears. She didn't stop until she reached the bathroom, where she locked herself in a stall and sank to the floor. Her hands trembled as she touched her hair, or what was left of it. The ends were uneven, the once beautiful curls now singed and lifeless. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The humiliation was suffocating, but beneath it burned a deeper emotion, anger. Anger at Mr. Grayson for his carelessness, at her classmates for their silence, and at herself for allowing this to happen. She stayed in the stall until the bell rang, signaling the end of class. When she finally emerged, her reflection in the mirror was almost unrecognizable. Her hair was a mess of charred ends and frizz, but it was the look in her eyes that startled her the most, a mix of pain, fury, and determination. Naomi didn't return to class that day. Instead, she walked home, each step fueled by the thought that she couldn't let this go. Mr. Grayson's dismissive attitude, the indifference of her peers, the systemic dismissal of her pain, it all boiled inside her, forming a resolve stronger than any flame. By the time she reached her front door, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Naomi sat on her bed, staring blankly at the pale yellow walls of her room. The sunlight streaming through the window felt almost mocking, as if the world outside was oblivious to the storm raging inside her. Her scalp still tingled, a painful reminder of what had happened. The smell of burnt hair clung to her clothes, no matter how many times she'd scrubbed her hands or showered. It was as if the humiliation had soaked into her skin, refusing to be washed away. She could hear her father's voice downstairs, muffled through the walls. He was on the phone, likely discussing a case. Normally, she'd find comfort in the steady rhythm of his work, but today it only heightened her unease. How was she supposed to explain this to him? How could she tell the man who had always fought for justice that she had been humiliated, injured, and belittled in front of her entire class, and had done nothing about it? The thought made her throat tighten. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms as tears welled in her eyes again. Naomi Carter didn't cry easily, but today she couldn't stop. The floodgates had opened, and every ounce of shame, anger, and pain came pouring out. By the time she heard her father's footsteps coming up the stairs, she had barely managed to pull herself together. The knock on her door was gentle, but it still made her flinch. "Naomi, can I come in?" Daniel's voice was calm but laced with concern. She hesitated, wiping her face quickly before replying, "Yeah." The door opened and Daniel stepped in, his sharp features softening the moment he saw her. He didn't say anything at first, just took a seat on the edge of her bed, his gaze sweeping over her. It was as if he could sense something was wrong without needing to ask. "What happened?" he finally said, his voice steady but firm. Naomi swallowed hard. She had rehearsed explanations in her head, tried to think of ways to minimize what had happened, but now that he was here, the words spilled out unfiltered. She told him everything, from Mr. Grayson's condescension to the experiment that went horribly wrong, to the way the class had watched her burn, both literally and metaphorically. Daniel's expression shifted as she spoke, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. By the time she finished, his eyes were dark with fury. "Said it was a minor mishap?" Daniel repeated, his voice dangerously low. Naomi nodded, her throat too tight to speak. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged tiger. She had seen this side of him before, when he was preparing for court, when he was channeling his anger into action. It was both reassuring and terrifying. "This is unacceptable," he said finally, his tone sharp. "You could have been seriously hurt, Naomi." And he dismissed it like it was nothing, like you were nothing. His words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they echoed her own feelings. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe he could fix this, that his determination could make everything right. "We're going to the school," Daniel continued, his voice steady with resolve. "Tomorrow, first thing. This isn't going to be swept under the rug." The thought of facing Mr. Grayson again made Naomi's stomach churn, but she nodded. She trusted her father. If anyone could hold the school accountable, it was him. The next morning, Naomi found herself sitting in the school's administrative office, her father beside her. The room was sterile, with beige walls and a faint smell of air freshener that did little to mask the tension hanging in the air. Across from them sat Principal Harris, a middle-aged woman with meticulously styled hair and an expression that was equal parts concern and calculation. "We take these matters very seriously," Harris said, folding her hands on the desk. "Mr. Grayson has assured me that it was an unfortunate accident. He deeply regrets what happened." "An accident?" Daniel's voice was calm, but the steel in his tone was unmistakable. He instructed her to deviate from the standard procedure, and that deviation resulted in my daughter's hair catching fire. That's not an accident. That's negligence. Harris shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. "Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration." "Do you?" Daniel cut her off, leaning forward slightly. "Do you understand what it's like to see your child come home burned and humiliated because of the carelessness of someone who's supposed to protect them?" Naomi watched as Harris's composure faltered. She felt a mix of awe and gratitude toward her father, but also a creeping sense of futility. Would anything actually change? Or would this meeting end with empty promises and no real consequences? "We will, of course, investigate the matter thoroughly," Harris said finally, her tone clipped. "In the meantime, we'll ensure that Mr. Grayson takes extra precautions in his classes moving forward." "Precautions aren't enough," Daniel said firmly. "He needs to be held accountable. If this had happened to any other student, would you be so quick to dismiss it?" Harris's face flushed, but she didn't respond. The meeting ended with promises of a formal inquiry, but Naomi could tell her father wasn't satisfied. As they walked back to the car, his silence was heavy, his anger barely contained. She wanted to say something, to thank him for standing up for her, but the words felt hollow in the face of her own doubts. That evening, Daniel sat at the dining table, poring over paperwork. Naomi watched from the doorway as he made phone calls, his voice sharp and commanding. He was mobilizing, reaching out to colleagues, gathering evidence. It was what he did best, building a case, piece by piece. "Dad?" she said hesitantly, stepping into the room. He looked up, his expression softening. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me." Daniel stood and pulled her into a hug. "Always," he said, "and I promise you, Naomi, we're not letting this go." For the first time since the incident, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope, but beneath it, a new resolve began to take root. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had been silenced, every specialist that had been brushed aside. If her father was willing to fight, then so was she. The days following the meeting with Principal Harris were tense and uncertain. Naomi had returned to school, though the weight of the incident lingered over her like a storm cloud. The hushed whispers in the hallways, the sidelong glances from her classmates, it all served as a constant reminder of what had happened. Mr. Grayson, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had occurred. He avoided looking at her directly, but his condescending tone persisted during class, leaving her seething with anger. At home, her father had thrown himself into action. Daniel Carter was not the kind of man to let things slide, especially not when it came to his daughter. He had started reaching out to his daughter. He had started reaching out to his network of colleagues, friends, and former clients, searching for any threads to pull. It didn't take long for him to find some. One evening, as Naomi sat at the dining table trying to focus on her homework, Daniel walked in with a folder in hand. His expression was grim but purposeful. "Naomi," he said, placing the folder in front of her, "I think it's time you see this." She hesitated, glancing at the folder as if it might bite her. What is it? It's a pattern, Daniel replied, his tone carefully measured. You're not the first student to face this kind of treatment at Pinewood, and Mr. Grayson, he's been a problem for years. Her heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Daniel sat down beside her, opening the folder. Inside were copies of old emails, written complaints, and testimonies from former students and parents. He handed her a typed letter dated 3 years earlier. Dear Principal Harris, Naomi read aloud, her voice shaking slightly. I'm writing to express my concerns about Mr. Grayson's behavior toward my son. He has repeatedly singled him out in class, using derogatory language and undermining his confidence. My son no longer feels safe in his classroom. Her voice trailed off and she looked up at her father, her chest tightening. This is about a black student, isn't it? Daniel nodded. It is. And there are more stories like this. Complaints were filed, but the administration never took them seriously. They labeled it as personality conflicts, or claimed the students were being overly sensitive. It was easier for them to protect the teacher than to address the real problem. Naomi flipped through the papers, her hands trembling. Each testimony painted a picture that was all too familiar. Students of color being targeted, dismissed, or outright humiliated by Mr. Grayson. The pattern was undeniable, and it made her blood boil. Why, hasn't anyone done anything? She asked, her voice rising with frustration. Why is he still teaching? Because it's easier to silence a few students than to admit there's a systemic problem, Daniel said bitterly, but that's about to change. Over the next week, Daniel's investigation gained momentum. He reached out to some of the families who had filed complaints against Mr. Grayson, many of whom were hesitant to revisit the past. However, a few agreed to speak with him. Their stories were strikingly similar to Naomi's, accounts of humiliation, microaggressions, and outright negligence. One evening, Naomi sat in on a Zoom call with one such family. The mother, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, recounted how her son had been constantly berated in front of his peers. Grayson made him feel like he wasn't good enough, the woman said, her voice tinged with both anger and sadness. He told my son that maybe science wasn't his thing, and when my son tried to defend himself, Grayson said he was being disrespectful. It crushed his confidence. Naomi felt a pang of recognition. She knew exactly how that boy must have felt, the sting of being told she didn't belong, that her best wasn't good enough. It was a wound that cut deep, and hearing it echoed in others' experiences only strengthened her resolve. I'm so sorry that happened to your son, Naomi said softly, her voice breaking. I know how it feels. The mother gave her a sad smile. You're brave for standing up to him. I wish we had done more. As Daniel continued building his case, Naomi decided to take matters into her own hands as well. She began talking to her classmates, carefully probing to see if anyone else had experienced or witnessed Mr. Grayson's behavior. Most were hesitant to speak, their fear of retaliation outweighing their willingness to help. But one student surprised her. Oh, I've seen what he does, said Elena, a quiet girl who sat near the back of the class. He always picks on you, and it's not just you. I've noticed it with other students too, mostly the ones who don't look like him. Naomi blinked, caught off guard by Elena's honesty. Why haven't you said anything? Elena looked down, fiddling with the straps of her backpack. Because what's the point? The school won't do anything. They never do. But if enough of us speak up, they'll have to listen, Naomi said, her voice firm. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone he's hurt. Don't you want that to stop?" Elena hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll help." It wasn't much, but it was a start. A turning point came when Daniel contacted a journalist friend, Lisa Ramirez, who had a reputation for exposing injustices in the education system. She was immediately intrigued by the story and agreed to meet with Naomi and her father. In Lisa's small office downtown, Naomi found herself recounting the incident with Mr. Grayson for the first time to someone outside her family. Lisa listened intently, her pen flying across her notebook as Naomi spoke. "This isn't just about one teacher," Lisa said when Naomi finished. "It's about the culture of the school. They've enabled him by ignoring the complaints. If we can bring this to light, it could force them to make real changes." Naomi nodded, her heart pounding. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she had a voice, like her story could actually make a difference. By the end of the week, Lisa's article was published online. The headline read, "Negligence and Prejudice, a Student's Fight for Justice at Pinewood Academy." The article detailed Naomi's experience as well as the stories of other students who had been targeted by Mr. Grayson. It painted a damning picture of a school that prioritized its reputation over the well-being of its students. Within hours, the story began gaining traction on social media. Comments poured in, some supportive, others skeptical. But the most important response came from the school itself. Principal Harris released a statement promising a thorough investigation into the allegations. It was a small victory, but Naomi knew the fight was far from over. The wheels of change had been set in motion, but the road ahead was still long and uncertain. As Naomi sat in her room that night, scrolling through the article's comments, she felt a mix of emotions: fear, anger, hope. The shadows of the past were finally coming to light, and she was determined to keep them there. The backlash came faster than Naomi expected. By the time she walked into school the morning after the article's release, it felt as if the entire student body had read it. Whispers followed her down the hallway, a symphony of hushed voices saying her name. Some students stared openly, while others avoided looking at her entirely. The weight of their attention pressed heavily on her, but she kept her head high, refusing to let them see her falter. The first confrontation came before she even reached her locker. Two girls from her chemistry class stopped her, their arms crossed and faces tight with disapproval. "Seriously, Naomi," one of them said, her voice low but sharp. "You couldn't just handle this privately? Now the whole school is under a microscope because of you." Naomi froze, gripping the straps of her backpack. "Handle it privately," she repeated, her voice trembling but firm. "You mean stay quiet like everyone else?" The second girl scoffed. "You're making it sound like Mr. Grayson is some kind of monster. He's strict, sure, but he's not racist. You're blowing this way out of proportion." Anger flared in Naomi's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You weren't the one he targeted. You didn't have your hair set on fire in front of the entire class." The first girl rolled her eyes. "It was an accident." Naomi opened her mouth to reply, but stopped herself. She knew arguing with them wouldn't change their minds. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. As much as she wanted to fight back, she couldn't waste her energy on people who refused to see the truth. By lunchtime, the tension in the school was palpable. Students clustered in groups, their conversations buzzing with speculation about what would happen next. Would Mr. Grayson be fired? Would the school's reputation take a hit? For many, the controversy felt like a disruption to their otherwise perfect lives. Naomi sat alone at her usual table, poking at her lunch without appetite. She could feel the stares from across the cafeteria, but she refused to look up. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. It was a text from Elena. "Meet me in the library after school. I have something to tell you." Naomi frowned but quickly typed back a reply, "Okay." The library was nearly empty when Naomi arrived. She found Elena sitting at a table in the back corner, her face pale and her hands fidgeting nervously. As Naomi approached, Elena looked up and gave her a weak smile. "Hey," Naomi said, sliding into the seat across from her. "What's going on?" Elena hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About speaking up. And I think I'm ready." Naomi's eyes widened. "Really? That's amazing, Elena. What changed your mind?" Elena bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the table. "I've been watching how people are treating you, and it's not fair. You're doing something brave, and they're acting like you're the problem. It made me realize I don't want to be one of the people who stays silent anymore." Naomi reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand. "Thank you. Your voice means so much." Elena nodded, her expression still uncertain. "But there's something else. I overheard some teachers talking in the staff room. They were saying that the administration is trying to downplay everything. They don't want this to get any bigger." Naomi's stomach sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her anger surge anew. "Of course they are," she muttered. "They care more about their reputation than their students." Meanwhile, outside the walls of Pinewood Academy, the story was gaining traction. Lisa Ramirez's article had been picked up by a larger news outlet, and parents began calling the school demanding answers. The administration scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing a statement that promised an internal investigation and urging the public to reserve judgment until the facts were confirmed. Daniel, however, wasn't about to let the school control the narrative. He doubled down on his efforts, arranging interviews with other affected families and gathering more evidence of the systemic issues at Pinewood. The more he uncovered, the more apparent it became that the problem extended beyond Mr. Grayson. The culture of silence and complicity was deeply entrenched. At home, Naomi watched her father work with a mixture of admiration and guilt. She was doing so much for her, sacrificing his time and energy to fight a battle that felt bigger than both of them. She wanted to help, but she wasn't sure how. Every time she spoke up, it seemed to make things worse, at least in the short term. One evening, as she sat at the dining table flipping through her chemistry notes, Daniel joined her, carrying a stack of documents. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice soft. Naomi shrugged. "It's hard. People at school, they don't get it. They think I'm overreacting." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Change is never easy, Naomi, but what you're doing matters. Don't let their ignorance discourage you." She nodded, his words giving her a small measure of comfort. "What about you? How's the case going?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Slowly. The school is stonewalling us, and some of the families I've contacted are too scared to speak out publicly. But we're making progress, little by little." Naomi hesitated, then said, "I want to do more. I don't want you to fight this alone." Daniel smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "You've already done so much by telling your story. But if you're ready for more, I think there's a way you can help." Over the next few days, Naomi and her father worked together to prepare for the next phase of their fight. They compiled a detailed timeline of events, including testimonies from other students and parents. Naomi also reached out to a few classmates who had quietly expressed support, encouraging them to share their experiences. It wasn't easy. Many were still too afraid to come forward, but a handful agreed. The turning point came when one of Mr. Grayson's former colleagues contacted Daniel. The teacher, now retired, revealed that she had witnessed his behavior firsthand and had even reported him to the administration years ago. Her testimony was damning, painting a picture of a man who had long abused his position of power without consequence. Armed with this new evidence, Daniel filed a formal complaint with the school district, demanding an independent investigation into Pinewood Academy's handling of the situation. The complaint attracted even more media attention, and soon the pressure on the school became impossible to ignore. Inside Pinewood, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Mr. Grayson's once commanding presence in the classroom was diminished, his every move scrutinized by students and staff alike. He seemed more cautious, but his resentment toward Naomi was palpable. She avoided him as much as possible, focusing instead on the growing support she was receiving from her peers. Elena, true to her word, began speaking up more boldly. Together, they formed a small but determined group of students who were willing to challenge the status quo. They started an online petition calling for stricter oversight of teachers and better protections for students, which quickly gained traction among the broader community. For the first time, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope. The tide was turning, and though the fight was far from over, she knew they were making a difference. As the week drew to a close, Naomi found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her. Her hair, still uneven from the incident, was a stark reminder of everything she had endured. But instead of feeling shame or anger, she felt something else: strength. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had been silenced, every voice that had been ignored. And she wasn't going to stop until they were heard. The morning of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud, heavy with anticipation and dread. Naomi woke early, her heart pounding with the mixture of fear and determination. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, interviews, planning, late-night phone calls. But nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Today, her story would be laid bare in front of the school board, the media, and the community. Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air. Daniel was already seated at the dining table, his laptop open and documents spread out before him. He looked up as Naomi entered the room, his expression softening. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, pushing a mug of tea toward her. "How are you feeling?" Naomi shrugged, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Nervous, scared, but ready." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "You're incredibly brave, Naomi. No matter what happens today, remember that." She nodded, though her throat felt tight. She took a sip of tea, savoring the warmth, and tried to steady her breathing. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might happen, how the school board would react, whether Mr. Grayson would even show up, and how the community would respond to her testimony. The car ride to the hearing was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound. Naomi stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. The school district's central office loomed ahead, its austere brick facade imposing against the gray sky. A small crowd had already gathered outside. Reporters with cameras, community members holding signs, and a few familiar faces from Pinewood Academy. Naomi's stomach churned as Daniel parked the car and stepped out. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his hand. She nodded, taking his hand and stepping into the chaos. The air buzzed with murmurs and the occasional shout, but Naomi kept her focus on the doors ahead. Cameras flashed as she and Daniel made their way inside, their steps echoing in the large, sterile hallway. The hearing room was already filling with people. Rows of chairs were packed with parents, teachers, and students, their faces a mixture of curiosity, support, and skepticism. At the front of the room sat the school board, a panel of 5 individuals who would decide the outcome of the case. Naomi recognized Principal Harris sitting off to the side, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable. Mr. Grayson was there too. He sat at a table with his lawyer, his face pale but composed. Naomi felt a wave of anger and fear rise in her chest, but she quickly pushed it down. She couldn't afford to lose focus now. Daniel guided her to their seats, whispering words of encouragement as they settled in. The room grew quiet as the lead board member, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, called the hearing to order. This meeting is to address the allegations brought against Mr. Charles Grayson and the administration of Pinewood Academy, she announced, her voice carrying easily across the room. We will begin with opening statement from the complainant. Daniel stood, his presence commanding as he addressed the room. He spoke with clarity and conviction, outlining the events that had led to this moment. He detailed the incident with Naomi, the pattern of complaints against Mr. Grayson, and the school's failure to act. His words painted a damning picture of a system that had prioritized its reputation over the safety and dignity of its students. When he finished, the room was silent. All eyes turned to Naomi. Naomi's heart raced as she stood, her knees trembling beneath her. She took a deep breath, her father's reassuring presence grounding her. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers, and began to speak. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I'm here today because I refuse to stay silent about what happened to me and to others at Pinewood Academy." She recounted the incident in vivid detail, her voice unwavering even as the memories threatened to overwhelm her. She described the humiliation of being singled out, the pain of the fire, and the indifference with which Mr. Grayson had dismissed her suffering. She spoke about the aftermath, the whispers, the isolation, and the courage it took to come forward. As she spoke, she saw some faces soften with empathy, while others remained skeptical, but she didn't let that stop her. She pushed forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "It's about every student who has ever felt silenced, dismissed, or devalued. It's about holding people accountable, not just Mr. Grayson, but the system that allowed him to continue hurting students for years." When she finally sat down, her hands were shaking, but she felt a surge of relief. She had said what she needed to say, and no matter the outcome, she knew she had done the right thing. The defense's argument was as predictable as it was infuriating. Mr. Grayson's lawyer painted him as a strict but dedicated teacher who had simply made an unfortunate mistake. They downplayed the allegations of racism, suggesting they were based on misunderstandings or misinterpretations. Principal Harris testified as well, her words carefully chosen to shift blame away from the school's administration. Naomi clenched her fists, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She wanted to shout, to refute their lies, but she knew she had to stay calm. Her father had prepared her for this, reminding her that their strength lay in their truth. The hearing dragged on, each side presenting evidence and questioning witnesses. One of the most powerful moments came when Lisa Ramirez, the journalist who had broken the story, was called to testify. She shared her findings, highlighting the pattern of complaints against Mr. Grayson and the administration's repeated failures to address them. The final blow came from a retired teacher who had worked alongside Mr. Grayson years earlier. Her testimony was clear and damning, describing how she had witnessed his behavior firsthand and had even filed her own complaints, which had been ignored. "This isn't about one incident," she said, her voice firm. "It's about a culture of negligence and complacency. It's about a system that allowed this to happen time and time again." As the hearing concluded, the board members retreated to deliberate. The room buzzed with tension as everyone waited for the decision. Naomi sat beside her father, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained from reliving the trauma and facing the scrutiny of so many eyes. Finally, the board returned. The lead member's expression was neutral as she addressed the room. "After careful consideration, the board has reached a decision. Mr. Charles Grayson will be placed on administrative leave, pending a thorough investigation. Additionally, Pinewood Academy will undergo an independent review of its policies and procedures to address the concerns raised during this hearing." The room erupted in whispers, some celebratory, others disappointed. Naomi felt a mix of emotions: relief that action was being taken, but frustration that it wasn't the definitive resolution she had hoped for. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. As Naomi and her father left the building, reporters swarmed them, shouting questions and snapping photos. Daniel shielded her as best he could, guiding her to the car. Once inside, Naomi let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling. "You were incredible today," Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. "No matter what happens next, you've already made a difference." Naomi nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming. Slowly, painfully, but it was coming. And she would be there to see it through. The days following the hearing felt like a strange limbo. Naomi returned to school, but the atmosphere was anything but normal. Pinewood Academy buzzed with the fallout of the hearing, the news spreading like wildfire through the student body, staff, and even the broader community. The school board's decision to place Mr. Grayson on leave and conduct an independent review had sent ripples through the institution, challenging the carefully curated image of perfection that Pinewood had maintained for years. For Naomi, the relief of knowing she had been heard was tempered by the ongoing tension. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, fueled by debates about whether she had done the right thing. Some students avoided her entirely, while others offered quiet words of support when no one else was around. It was a mixed bag of reactions that left her feeling both vindicated and isolated. Her first day back in chemistry class was especially difficult. The substitute teacher, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, introduced himself and acknowledged the tension in the room. "I understand this has been a challenging time for everyone," he said gently. "But I'm here to make sure we can move forward together." Naomi appreciated his words, but the stares from her classmates were harder to ignore. As she took her seat, she noticed Elena smiling at her from across the room, a small gesture, but one that gave her strength. She focused on the lesson, determined not to let the weight of others' opinions crush her. Outside of school, the fight for accountability continued. The independent review of Pinewood's policies was underway, with interviews being conducted and documents scrutinized. Daniel kept Naomi updated on the progress, his determination as fierce as ever. "This isn't just about Grayson," he told her one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. "It's about changing the entire system, and that takes time." Naomi nodded, though patience wasn't her strong suit. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for every student who had been silenced or ignored. Still, she trusted her father's judgment and was grateful for his unwavering support. In the meantime, Naomi found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She thought about the girl she had been before the incident, quiet, focused, content to excel academically without drawing too much attention. That girl had been forced to confront the harsh realities of prejudice and systemic failure. And she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more aware of her own power. The changes at Pinewood were slow but noticeable. The administration began implementing new policies to address the issues raised during the hearing. Mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for teachers and staff was announced, along with the creation of a student advisory board to give students a voice in school decisions. Naomi was invited to join the board, and though she hesitated at first, she ultimately agreed. Her first meeting with the board was both daunting and inspiring. Sitting in a room with other students, some of whom had also faced challenges at Pinewood, she felt a sense of solidarity she hadn't experienced before. They shared their stories, brainstormed ideas for improvement, and worked together to draft proposals for the administration. One of the first initiatives they proposed was the establishment of a peer support network, where students could seek help and advice from their peers in a safe, confidential environment. Naomi took the lead on this project, pouring her energy into creating something that could make a tangible difference. As the weeks turned into months, Naomi began to see the fruits of her labor. The peer support network launched successfully, with dozens of students signing up as mentors and mentees. The chemistry classroom, once a place of dread, became a space where she could focus on her love for science without fear of humiliation. And though not everyone supported her, she found solace in the growing number of students and teachers who stood by her. One afternoon, as she walked through the halls of Pinewood, she overheard a conversation between two younger students. They were discussing the new policies and how they felt safer speaking up about their concerns. Naomi smiled to herself, her heart swelling with pride. This was why she had fought so hard, so that others wouldn't have to endure what she had. At home, Naomi's relationship with her father grew even stronger. They spent hours talking about their shared experiences and dreams for the future. Daniel encouraged her to think about how she could continue making a difference, both at Pinewood and beyond. "You have a gift, Naomi," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. "Your voice has the power to inspire change. Don't ever forget that." His words stayed with her, planting a seed of ambition that began to grow. Naomi started researching careers in social justice and advocacy, inspired by her father's work and her own experiences. She realized that she wanted to dedicate her life to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The end of the school year brought a sense of closure, but also a sense of anticipation for what lay ahead. At the annual awards ceremony, Naomi was recognized not only for her academic achievements, but also for her contributions to the school community. As she stood on stage, accepting the award, she felt a wave of emotions: pride, gratitude, and determination. After the ceremony, Elena approached her with a shy smile. "You deserve this," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. You've done so much for all of us." Naomi hugged her, feeling a deep sense of connection. "Thank you. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us." That summer, Naomi decided to make a bold move. She cut her hair, embracing the short, natural style that had grown out after the incident. It was a symbolic act, one that represented her journey from pain to empowerment. She stood in front of the mirror, running her fingers through her curls, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace with herself. As she prepared for her final year at Pinewood, Naomi knew that her journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new battles to fight, but she was ready. She had found her voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Standing in her room, surrounded by the photos, awards, and memories that marked her growth, Naomi looked out the window at the world beyond. It was vast, uncertain, and full of possibility, and she was ready to face it head-on. A new chapter had begun, and Naomi was determined to write it on her own terms. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe for more impactful narratives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and explore our channel for other stories that inspire and challenge perspectives. Stay connected, and see you in the next one.